Okay, let's restart. And there was a question in the chat box. So maybe should I read it, or Kalam, do you want to speak about this?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to just speak. I didn't mean to send it. I hadn't finished, but you can't indent on the Zoom chat. Um, but yeah, I was kind of curious to the way that you used like the absurd size argument to counter the kind of being conscious, because it feels like in that equation, like you're shifting having a size into kind of being conscious, where I feel like having a size is kind of a physical property, right? You have like 3 dimensions that make up size, whereas the state of kind of being conscious, I would say, is kind of different and couldn't be equated to just simply possessing a physical property. And so to say that because something has size or doesn't mean you cannot measure it by degrees. It feels as if the concept of having the size versus being conscious would allow you to do that. You don't be size, and you can't have conscious.
So first, is everybody seeing the slide with the
Yes.
two?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, so in response to the question, I guess I'm thinking that we should be thinking more abstractly here, just about the general form of the argument. And the distinction that I want to highlight here is the distinction between a property F and the property of being F or having F. That's what this next slide is also trying to illustrate, that just because having F or being F doesn't come in degrees. For example, having mass doesn't come in degrees. That doesn't entail that the property itself, mass, also doesn't come in degrees. So all I'm saying on this slide in the analogy with size is that if you basically look at the logical structure or the semantic structure of this argument, then the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And the general inferential pattern here is that from the fact that having or being F, the people making this argument are drawing the conclusion that F itself doesn't come in degrees. So it doesn't really matter what we put in place of F, whether it's size or a consciousness or whatever. The point is that that kind of inference doesn't generally hold. And because of that, because it doesn't generally hold, that means that there must be something wrong with the determinacy objection. I mean, that's compatible with the conclusion of the objection still being true. It's just showing that the premises don't by themselves show that the conclusion is true. Maybe you were thinking about other kinds of disanalogies between size and consciousness. And I mean, of course, I think there's going to be many. But I think that for the purposes of this objection, we can abstract away from those disanalogies and just think about the inferential patterns.
Does that answer your question, Kalam?
Yeah, no, I appreciate your answer. I would follow up immediately with, in a couple of slides, you say that you cannot determine the size of, you cannot, in some cases, measure, for example, like an apple being greater than a banana because of the dimension change. Could you not order them by the accumulation of these dimensions? Like, is surely volume as an accumulation of the length, width, and depth a kind of way that they are indeed orderable?
Yeah, so you could think of size as just volume, in which case you'll get total orderability. And in that respect, maybe size is an imperfect example in this context, but there's going to be other kinds of properties that are multidimensional where there's not any obvious way of like agglomerating the values along the different dimensions. For example, think about health. Let's say that I'm like really physically fit but now is a really healthy eater. But I eat badly and now doesn't exercise. So in this circumstance, you might think, well, we can't really say whether I'm healthier than now or now is healthier than me. We have these different dimensions of health, and they're not really comparable in any principled, objective way. And that's what Bain, Hoey, and Owen and other people talking about multidimensionality are suggesting about consciousness, that we might think of consciousness as being this multidimensional phenomenon where there's not any obvious projection from that multidimensional space onto a single value like we get that, like you could get with size, where you get a projection from the three different size dimensions onto volume, or something along those lines. So to put it another way, I think you could think of size as just equivalent to volume, in which case you get total orderability. You could think of it in a different way where you get partial orderability, where it's neither the case that apple is bigger than banana nor banana bigger than apple. And I think that's sort of just a particular thing about size. The more general thing is that we can accept that multidimensionality sometimes entails a lack of total ordering. But even if that is the case, then there's still something wrong with the multidimensionality objection. It still doesn't work.
Does that make sense, Colin?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. I guess, yeah, I mean, I think it's a very large debate that could go on for a long time, but I feel like being able to order, like if this, as you say, as it's written right here, if consciousness is multidimensional, then a set of conscious states isn't orderable. I think you can order stuff in multiple dimensions. I just think that it requires like a full knowledge. And I feel like when it comes to biological systems or systems like the brain, which are relatively poorly understood, I mean, even in your example of health, like healthy eating and being fit, that, you know, maybe healthy eating is a dimension of being fit, or the other way around, but there are so many countless dimensions that would affect either state, that we may like throw our hands up and say we can't order them. But perhaps in some theoretical sense, if we knew every single dimension, would we not be able to make a kind of conglomeration of all those dimensions and then reach a total ordering?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and a good thought to, press a bit on. So let me say two things. One is that, let's suppose you're right. Well, that doesn't really matter that much for the present dialectic that I'm engaged in, because basically what you're saying is that we should be skeptical of premise two, that multidimensionality entails a lack of orderability. Maybe we just lack the relevant knowledge or the relevant function in these cases. And that may be true. But if that is true, then that just means that we have further reason to doubt the multidimensionality objection. So that's sort of just further reason to think that this isn't a good reason for thinking that consciousness doesn't come in degrees. The second thought that I was going to express is that I guess other kinds of examples make me think that there will be, that it's very unlikely that all properties will be associated with a total ordering. So here's another example. Think about logical strength. So some formal systems are logically stronger than others in that the former entail all of the theorems that the latter entails, but not vice versa. But in many cases, you have incomparability with respect to logical strength. Maybe you have one formal system that can prove that from which you can prove some theorems that the other can't, and in the other formal system, you can prove some theorems that the first one can't. And in those sorts of cases, what we say is neither is stronger than the other. They're just incomparable with respect to logical strength. So that seems to me to be a case where it's pretty hard to say that, well, we just don't have all of the relevant facts. It is the case that one of these systems is stronger than the other. So the point there is that even if you're a bit skeptical about the health case, there's other cases that I think that are a little bit harder to resist. But the more important point was just the first point that we could accept what you're thinking. And I mean, this is something that is debated to some extent by philosophers. But if what you're saying is correct, then that doesn't really matter that much for the big picture that we're talking about here, because you're just giving another criticism of the multidimensionality objection.
Yeah, I was just more curious about the path of getting there.
Mhm.
Okay. Maybe if Karam, are you fine with this?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's I
Okay.
was curious about the debate.
All right, then maybe I actually have some follow-up question then about this. Although it may be too long, if it feels too long, and if you, Andrew, it's better to finish to get to the point, that may be also fine. Which one do you prefer?
Why don't you ask the question, and then
Okay.
I'll defer if I think that would be better.
All right, so then just in a sense, it's more of the comment or sort of a summary of the point that Karam has raised about that consciousness versus size debate thing, the comparison. In a way, what another way to summarize what they were saying, on the left side is that assuming that the consciousness is a binary thing, then it doesn't make sense to talk about the binary and the degree at the same time. And then you are actually saying that no, actually there are cases where there is simultaneously there is a binary presence or absence, and within presence there is a degree. That's the kind of the picture you also showed in the consciousness determinacy, not determinate versus determinate, and with a degree, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so then that's first component to summarize, and then the other thing is that about so this motivation of putting this size in comparison to consciousness is that so having this binary or continuous, you have at least 4 different types of the concepts that can have different kind of a structure with respect to binariness and also degreeness. That's what this kind of table shows, right?
Mhm.
Okay, then other things. So and your ideas of this total order, partial order is totally consistent with what I also thought about that baseball player, soccer player. So that's I think we are really on the same page about that. That's really great. And then with respect to the last sort of comment from Karan, I think there is an it's potentially worth discussing potentially at the end, but I have a kind of feeling that not only Karan but many of the students, also not only the student, academic overall, many people believe that there is an objective truth about everything.
There is or is not?
There is. So if we know the state of the world completely, perfectly by research or by measurement, in the sense that there is no limit in what we can know and measure, called no epistemological kind of limit, then the world is completely fixed, and we can have a unified concept and a unified agreement about everything. The disagreement between me and Andrew is just because of the fact that we don't know everything at the same time. But if we agree on everything, if we know everything, like the component that contributes to health, then everybody should, in the end, arrive at the uniform, one single index that measures health. That's, I think, sort of the underlying assumption about this epistemological kind of truth, the limitation that limits this disagreement or agreement. On the other hand, what I want to raise is another possibility that things are not determinable in that way. That's an ontological sort of indeterminacy. Even if we know everything, and even if we can measure everything, there are things that just we can't order. And I think Andrew's idea of the logic is actually quite interesting. But another thing that I also feel like it's a very simple kind of situation is a rock, hand, and scissors, right? Rock is stronger than scissors, and the scissors is stronger than the paper, and the paper is stronger than the rock. In this case, even if we know everything about this structure and all the possibility, probability, everything, we just can't order things. It's a state of the matter, structure of the things in the logical things. And there are things like this nature, we can't just order things. I think that's a sort of alternative possibility.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I would agree with you now. I wasn't inferring that all logic is obtainable. I do certainly agree with this kind of ontological indeterminacy. I think that's very true. It's more just about, I was curious about Andrew's structure of argument, because that's how I felt that it was being framed.
Okay.
So let me say a few things here. I feel like now we're getting into these very heavy duty philosophical issues about like the nature of reality and its relationship to knowledge. And well, I think we should maybe set aside them insofar as we can. But here's one distinction that might be helpful. So you were suggesting a choice point between this idea that all of reality is objective. There's an objective fact of the matter about everything, versus the idea that there's some ontological indeterminacy in some cases. I think that I just wanted to bring up some other examples where you might think there's no fact of the matter about something, but where it's not because there's like a gap in reality, where it's just much more prosaic and mundane and ordinary. So think about vague predicates, for example, being bald. Let's say that we remove hairs from me until I'm somewhere in the borderline between being bald and not being bald. So I'm a borderline case of baldness. So one thing you could think, one view you could take is that there has to be this objective fact of the matter about whether I'm bald or not in that situation. And in fact, some people do argue for this. But most philosophers think that that's kind of silly. There's just no fact of the matter here. Our concept of baldness is not determinate enough to specify whether borderline bald people do count as bald or not. And it's not like there's something missing in reality. It's just a matter of the imprecision in our concepts or in our terms. So I think that in many cases, it might be that we could pose a question. For example, is apple bigger than banana, or is now healthier than me? Or is this formal system logically stronger than this other formal system? And a natural thought is that there might be no answer here, not because there's something missing in reality, but just because the way that our concepts work doesn't yield any answer to that question. It's sort of like analogous to the baldness case, where there's something ill-formed about the question in the first place. Yeah, maybe I'll just end there.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's good. And maybe we can come back to it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. Is there any question from anybody else? I don't think. Yeah. All right. Let's go ahead.
Okay. So just to recap, what I've done is introduce the topic, defended the conceptual coherence of degrees of consciousness from its main objections. And what I'm going to do now is present my positive view, an account of what it would take for consciousness to come in degrees. And let me start off with the basic idea. So the core idea behind my view is that what it is to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. You can think of that as the slogan for my view. And I think that simple slogan basically captures the essence of what it would be for consciousness to come in degrees. And basically the idea is that for any theory of consciousness, we can fill in the blank for a statement of this form. For X to be conscious, just is for X to be blank, for X to have high order representations, for X to have a global workspace, for X to have a maximal degree of integrated information. Put in whatever you want, your favorite theory of consciousness. And then after we fill in the blank, we can ask, is that something that can be possessed to a greater or lesser degree by different creatures? And if so, then that indicates that consciousness does come in degrees. And if not, then that indicates that it doesn't. Let me give some toy examples to give you more of a feel for how I'm thinking about things. So here's one example, just to illustrate the line of thought. So let's say that what it is to be conscious is to have a soul. Okay, well, souls don't come in degrees, and every creature has exactly one soul. So if this sort of view of consciousness is correct, then it's very plausible that consciousness doesn't come in degrees. On the other hand, imagine consciousness is more like water. There's some in you and some in me. Maybe both of us have more of it than a fish, but maybe less of it than an octopus. And if that kind of picture is correct, then I think it's very natural to hold that consciousness does come in degrees. So that gives you a flavor for how I'm thinking about things. So let me now try to make this a little bit more systematic. So what I'm going to do in the next slide is I'm going to make some basic observations about what it would take for a degree property to be degree of consciousness. And then those observations I'll be able to turn into a general philosophical analysis. Okay, so I'll make 4 observations. Each observation is going to be a conditional statement of the form, if consciousness does come in degrees, then some condition has to hold. So basically, I'm going to identify a bunch of necessary conditions for something to be degree of consciousness that I think are all very plausible. And this is going to give us some constraints on what can properly count as degree of consciousness, of what exactly it takes for a property to be degree of consciousness. Okay, so here's the first observation. If consciousness comes in degrees, then we should expect that differences in degrees of consciousness should entail differences in phenomenology, differences in what it's like. For example, suppose that you think consciousness does come in degrees, and suppose that your theory says that now and I have a different degree of consciousness. Well, if that's the case, then it should follow that what it's like to be now is different from what it's like to be me. If that weren't the case, then it would be unclear why the degree property we're talking about should be thought of as degree of consciousness rather than degree of something else. That seems pretty reasonable to me. Okay, here's the second condition. If consciousness comes in degrees, then degrees of consciousness should correspond to some dimension of phenomenal similarity. So here's an example. Let's say that now is more conscious than me, and that I'm more conscious than you. Okay, so your consciousness increases as you rise through the academic ranks. So if that's the situation, then we should expect that what it's like to be now is more similar in some respect to what it's like to be me than what it's like to be you. So in other words, degree of consciousness should track some dimension of phenomenal similarity. And again, if that weren't the case, then it's arguable that whatever degree property we're talking about wouldn't really be degree of consciousness, it would be degrees of something else. So those first 2 criteria, I think, are pretty straightforward to identify. The third criterion will take a little bit more work to explain. So the third criterion says, if consciousness comes in degrees, then anything with a positive degree of consciousness is conscious simplicar, is simply conscious. So let me illustrate this with comparisons to some other degree properties. So think for a moment about circularity. So circularity comes in degrees. Some shapes are more circular than others. And there's also the property of being a circle. And we could ask, how high of a degree of circularity does something have to have in order to be a circle? And obviously the answer is it has to have a maximal degree of circularity. If it has less than maximal circularity, then it's not really a circle, it's an oval or some other kind of shape. By contrast, think about mass. In order for something to have mass, it doesn't have to have maximal mass. That doesn't even make sense. It just has to have a minimal degree of mass. As long as it has a positive mass value, it has mass. Or think about warmness. That's an intermediate case. In order for something to be warm, it has to have more than minimal warmness, but less than maximal warmness. It has to surpass some intermediate threshold of warmness. So we could ask the analogous question about consciousness. If consciousness comes in degrees, then what conceptually should we expect about the relationship between degrees of consciousness and being conscious? And I think if you think about it, consciousness is like mass. If consciousness comes in degrees, then so long as an entity has a minimal degree of consciousness, then that entity is going to be conscious. I mean, I think that's why people say things like, even if an entity is barely conscious, the entity still counts as being conscious. That just seems like a conceptual truth about consciousness. So that's the third observation. And the fourth observation I've already expressed. It's just the slogan. To be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. So all these observations are quite intuitive. In fact, I think these are all just conceptual truths. But the interesting thing is, I think these observations place constraints on what it takes for a degree property to be degree of consciousness. And in fact, I think these observations give us the ingredients that we need for a more systematic philosophical analysis of degrees of consciousness. So let me walk you through them. So the idea is that, let's say we have some degree property. Let's just call it phi. We're asking, what does it take for phi to be degree of consciousness? And my answer is that 3 conditions have to be satisfied. One is what I'll call the difference criterion. If x and y have different phi values, then what it's like to be x must be different from what it's like to be y. That's just a schematization of the first observation from the last slide. If now is more conscious than me, then what it's like to be now must be different from what it's like to be me. Second observation, second criterion is what I'll call the similarity criterion. If x has a higher phi value than y, which has a higher phi value than z, then what it's like to be x must be more similar in some respect to what it's like to be y than what it's like to be z. So that's just a schematization of the second observation from the last slide. So remember, if now is more conscious than me and I'm more conscious than you, then what it's like to be now should be more similar in some respect to what it's like to be me than what it's like to be you. And then the third criterion is what I'll call the threshold criterion. For x to be conscious just is for x to be to have a positive phi value. So that's basically combining the third and fourth observations from the last slide. So the third observation was that if consciousness comes in degrees, then consciousness is kind of like mass. Anything with a positive degree of consciousness is going to be conscious. And the fourth observation was the slogan, to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. And the threshold criterion is combining those two ideas. And one thing I should mention is that the threshold criterion is particularly important here because it's connecting degrees of consciousness to the nature of consciousness. And I think what that does is it enables us to solve one of the biggest challenges that arises in thinking about degrees of consciousness, namely the challenge of determining when a degree property is just a degreed feature of consciousness versus degrees of consciousness itself. That, I think, is a really hard question, but I think it's a question that we can solve using basically the philosophical tools that I'm presenting here. So here's an example. Think about vivacity. Some experiences are more vivid than others. Perceptual experiences are more vivid than imaginative experiences. And suppose we ask, are experiences that are more vivid experiences that are more conscious. And I think it's not very obvious, just intuitively. I mean, I think that it's not really clear what we should say just by thinking about those kinds of experiences. And what we would want is some sort of independent criterion by which we can determine the answer to this question. And what the threshold criterion does is it gives us that independent criterion. It says that the answer depends on whether more vivid experiences have more of what consciousness is, what makes it the case that entity is conscious, or a mental state is conscious, than less vivid experiences. And what this does is it enables us to rule out most features as candidates for degree of consciousness, because we don't want to just say that any degreed feature of consciousness is degrees of consciousness itself. That would be way too permissive. That's something that you sometimes see in the consciousness literature. For example, sometimes people have suggested that more clear perceptions are more conscious than more fuzzy perceptions. But I mean, it's obvious that more clear perceptions are more clear than more fuzzy perceptions, but it's not obvious that they're more conscious. And what this analysis enables us to do is it gives us a framework for assessing these sorts of claims. And one thing that's required for those claims to be true is that the feature under consideration, clarity or vivacity or whatever, is connected to the nature of consciousness. Okay, there's more I could say to like explain what exactly, how exactly to understand these notions, in particular the just is statement here. But I'm going to skip that because I think that's not so relevant to the present context. So the important point is that this gives us, in some ways, a recipe for determining whether a degreed feature should be thought of as degrees of consciousness. And it's pretty hard to satisfy the conditions here. It's pretty hard to satisfy all three of these criteria, especially the threshold criterion. And again, this is now getting sort of into the philosophical weeds. But if you want to think about the basic idea, it's just this slogan that I expressed earlier. To be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. All of this stuff that had followed is in some ways attempting to give a more systematic philosophical analysis of this slogan. Okay, so that's basically my positive view. And what I'm going to do in this last part is I'm going to look at some theories of consciousness and apply the analysis to those theories, both to show that we get intuitively correct results and to give you more of a flavor for how the reasoning, the analysis itself works. So there are many theories of consciousness, as I'm sure you all have seen in this class. And I've listed here some of the more prominent ones today. And for each theory, I've listed the relevant analysis of consciousness that that theory will endorse. So obviously, I don't have time to talk about all of these. What I'm going to do is consider things at kind of a bigger level of abstraction. I'm going to consider just two broad classes of theories and show how the analysis applies in those cases. So first, let's think about attentional theories. There's a lot of philosophers and scientists who think that consciousness is just a certain form of attention. And on the most common versions of this view, what makes a mental state conscious is that it occupies the subject's attention to some degree. So on this picture, you have various mental states, perceptions, cognitions, emotions, and so forth. And consciousness is just a matter of allocating attention to those mental states. So suppose then that we ask, if a theory of this kind is correct, does consciousness come in degrees? And really, there are two questions we can ask here. First, if this theory is correct, are some creatures more conscious than others? Second, if this theory is correct, are some mental states more conscious than others? So let's focus on mental states. And here's the basic idea. If an attentional theory is correct, then what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for that mental state to occupy a subject's attention. And that means that it's possible for one mental state to have more of what it is that makes a mental state conscious than another. And then the prediction of my view is going to be that degrees of attention will be degrees of consciousness if we assume this view is correct. And I think that's the intuitive result. So to simplify a little, if consciousness just is attention, then more attention means more consciousness. And I think, in fact, the basic reasoning here generalizes. Any theory of consciousness that takes it to be a matter of some degreed awareness relation is going to yield the same results. And I think that actually covers a good number of theories of consciousness. For example, it applies to certain kinds of higher order theories as well. So that illustrates one way in which consciousness might come in degrees. Here's a very different way in which that might turn out to be the case. Let's think about what I'll call atomist theories. So the basic idea behind atomist theories is that total conscious experiences are composed from more basic atomic experiences. And there's lots of ways of understanding what exactly these atoms actually are. I won't go into that. Basically, my analysis predicts that if atomism is true, then a subject whose total experience is composed from more atomic experiences is going to be more conscious than a subject whose total experience is composed from fewer atomic experiences. And I think that's the intuitive result if you step back and think about the kind of picture of consciousness that atomism gives us. If atomism is true, then subjects whose experiences are composed from a greater number of atomic experiences have more of whatever consciousness is than other subjects. And so they're more conscious, given my view. So what I've done is I talked about two broad classes of theories of consciousness. Let me step back and make a broader point, which is in order to confirm the degrees thesis, to show that consciousness comes in degrees, what you have to do, I think, is show that some degree property satisfies the different criteria that I've set forth. In order to falsify the degrees thesis, one has to show that there's no property that satisfies those criteria. And I think it's harder to show the universal negation here than merely that there's some property that satisfies the criterion. And given this, I think that it's plausible that many, arguably most theories are going to entail that some degree property satisfies these criteria. And given that, I think we can make the following speculation. I think consciousness probably comes in degrees. I mean, the jury's still out. We don't know what exactly consciousness is yet. But if you survey the landscape of contemporary theories of consciousness and think about what they say about the nature and structure of consciousness, and if you think about what exactly it would mean for consciousness to come in degrees in the first place, I think it's pretty plausible that most theories are going to entail that consciousness comes in degrees in some way or other. So that basically is my view on the matter. So let me wrap up now. At the very beginning, I noted that occasionally you hear people wonder things like whether a human is more conscious than an octopus, or whether a dog is more conscious than a fish, whether a stimulated state is more conscious than a psychedelic state. And I haven't answered these questions or even tried to answer them, but what I've aimed to do is argue that these aren't bad questions. I mean, maybe it'll turn out that every creature is exactly as conscious as every other creature, but maybe not. In fact, I think probably not. So I haven't answered these questions, but what I've tried to do is develop a framework that allows us to more clearly see how these kinds of questions might be answered, which I think that's some progress. And at the very beginning of this talk, what I did is I introduced this idea of a consciousness meter, and I asked if we're going to construct a consciousness meter, maybe an idealized consciousness meter, should it be more like a metal detector or more like a food thermometer? And I think we still don't really know the answer, but I've also suggested that the food thermometer model seems more likely. And I think for some people, that's kind of a surprising conclusion, because skeptics of degrees of consciousness have asserted that it barely makes sense to ask whether a human is more conscious than an octopus, that the idea of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. But what I've tried to do is explain how we can assess which of these models is correct. basically by looking at our best theories of consciousness, by seeing what exactly they say about the nature and structure of consciousness, and then by assessing whether some creatures have more of that than others. And given that, I think that maybe the most interesting question here isn't whether consciousness comes in degrees. At least I think it probably does. But instead, what degrees of consciousness actually turn out to be? That's a question that I think is sensible and interesting, and I think is something worth exploring. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. One thing I always regret is with this, Zoom setting is that you can't hear the upload from everybody.
Well, I heard yours.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so let's take a break for 4 minutes. And also, before going to the break, I also want to do 3 alternative forced choice questions that I usually do in the class. So maybe, Andrew, can you again give me the...
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it would be interesting to hear what you guys think about this question during the break. So if you are in the dark room, just inside a dark room, right? And then given Andrew's, argument, what do you think is more or less conscious? Okay, so if you're choosing A, that means that you think that you are more conscious in the brighter room compared to the dark room. And then B is you are to the same degree of consciousness in the dark room or brighter room. And then C is something that you can't really make up your mind, unclear. Okay, so now option A is more conscious in the brighter, B is the same, C is unclear, and please give a poll and also put your response question in chat box while we are taking 4-minute break.